All right, so this is part four, and just for some context, see that? See that? This is the third time I'm recording this thing. Okay, so let's see if we can get it right this time. Okay, so we're looking at match each equation to the graph below, put the correct letter next to the equations. So with matching, there's kind of like a shortcut that we can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of do the quick and dirty about how to get through we're doing the minimal amount. And then I'm going to go back and then we're going to dissect each graph and write the equation for the graph and then match it. So right now we're just going to do something quick. So let's look at the first graph. So first thing I'm going to do with a graph is make sure I know my where my hash marks are. So like for instance, here's a 2, right? There's a 2 right there. So that's telling me that wait a minute, no, there's a 2 right here too. But see this one, there's 0, and then it hits 2. So that means this would be 4. This would be -2, and this would be -4 because each of your units, it moves in twos. So 2, 4, 6, 8. But this one, they've got a 2 right there, but there's also a line right here. That's 1, 2, and that high point would be 3. This is -1, -2, and then the low point would be -3. So now that we got that, let's hit the amplitude up. So, oh, sorry, we forgot. First, let's talk about what kind of graph it is. So we're either looking at sine or cosine. Well, sine, it starts at the midline, which in this case, for y and x, it would be the origin. And that's exactly where this graph is starting. So origin or midline hits the high point, goes back to the midline, hits the low point, and then ends at the midline. That's one complete sine cycle. So we're looking at a sine graph. And so now let's look at the amplitude. Well, the amplitude for this, right, is if this is the midline, it's 1, 2, 3. So we got sine 3, okay? So we can stop right there because if we look at our graphs, there's only one graph that's got an amplitude of 3 for sine. So that's A, right? Now just when I go back over it, I'll go over the frequency and all that good stuff. So now let's look at this graph. Well, we already know that our units are in 2, so it went to 4. Let's look at our units going to the side. So left and right, I got 0 and then I hit 2 pi. So each one of my units going left to right is 2 pi. So if this is 2 pi, that means that's 4 pi, and then that would be 6 pi, and this would be 8 pi. We had some bell work that looked just like this. So now that we got our units, let's look at amplitude. Nope, let's get the graph first and then look at the amplitude. So just like the first graph, we're starting at the origin, we're hitting a high point, we're getting back at the midline, hitting a low point, and ending at the midline. So that's one complete sine cycle. So I'm looking at sine, right? And so now let's look at the amplitude. So my amplitude for this graph, if this is the midline, 2, 4 is the high point. So I have an amplitude of 4. So I can stop right there because if I look at all my graphs or all my equations, I've only got one that has an amplitude of 4. So bada boom, bada bing. That would be B. Right, so next, let's look right here. Now something seems off. Well, this is usually the midline. So because this is the midline and my graph is up there, that's leading me to believe that I have a vertical shift, something moved up or down. And then let's further confirm that by thinking about our units for our graph. So right here I got from 0 to 1, so that means this high point is 2. And that means this is 0, and then that's -1 for my low point. So my high point of the graph is 2. My low point of the graph is 0. So my high point and my low point are not opposites. So that definitely tells me that, what me and Penny were talking about the other day, that definitely is pushing me in the direction that there's a vertical shift. Okay, so let's figure out what kind of vertical shift. Well, I'm looking at this graph. Oops. The high point is 2 and the low point is 0. So the midline will be in the middle of those two. So from 0 to 1 and then from 1 to 2. So that means 1 is my midline. So we're going to draw that little blase. Yeah, that's pretty bad, but that's okay. So now we got our midline. Now we can get our amplitude. And we forgot to talk about what graph this is. So let's talk about what graph it is. It starts high, hits the midline, goes low, hits the midline, goes back high again to finish it off. That is a cosine graph. So that lead me to believe that it's a cosine graph. And so now let's get the amplitude. So if that's the midline, my amplitude is from the midline to the highest point. So there's only one unit right there going from 1 to 2. You can think about it like 2 minus 1 is 1. So my amplitude is 1. So what about my frequency? Well, wait a minute. Now that we know our midline, let's see if we can figure out, before we do our frequency, let's figure out if there's a vertical shift. The red line right here that I drew, that is on the x-axis. That is ordinarily the middle line or the midline of my cosine graph. But where's the midline at for this graph? It's at 1. It went up 1 unit. So then that means my vertical shift will be 1. So I'm going to go look back at the graphs real quick. There's only one graph that has a vertical shift of up, right? I mean, there's another one that has a vertical shift, but this one is the only one that's up. So I could, for giggles, I could try to find the other one that has the vertical shift going down, because that's what this says. But we're doing this the fast way, so we're going to just give that E because of that going up. All right, so next we got this one. So first, let's think about our units. Well, that's a 1 going up, so then that's a -1 going down. Right here is 1/4 pi, or pi over 4. So then if that's pi over 4, and this is 3 pi over 4, that means we're moving in fourths. So this is like 1/4 pi, and this is 3/4 pi. So then what would that have to be? 1/4, 2/4. So that's 2/4 pi. But you know, when you have a fraction or a ratio, you always reduce it. So I can reduce that to pi over 2. And if that's 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, then that means this one will be 4/4 pi. But again, if I can reduce it, I will. So the 4's cancel off, and I'm just left with pi. So now let's think about what we got. So what kind of graph is this? Well, I'm not really sure just yet, but I do know that there are like 3 possibilities, right? But the question is, so is it a sine graph? Well, if it's a sine graph, I should have started right here, and it didn't. So that's telling me that there is one of two possibilities. Either there's a negative in front of the sine function, or or it has a phase shift of, say, it moved forward or backward 2 pi. So either that, or we got sine of x plus or minus pi over 2. So there's only one graph or equation up here with a phase shift. So that's got to be F. So I can stop right there. All right, so next, here's that other graph that I was talking about that looks to have a vertical shift, because this is the midline. And my midline is somewhere down here. So let's count our units first. So from 0 to this one, that's only 1 unit. So that means these are 1 unit. So that's -1, -2, -3, -4. Right here is pi. So then that means this is halfway going. So that's half pi. And if this is a half of pi, and then this is pi, then this will be 1.5 pi, or 3 pi over 2. And then finally, this will be 2 pi right there. Well, it's 2 pi right there. Okay, so now let's think about what we, matter of fact, let's move these up so they're out the way. So I got pi over 2, I got 3 pi over 2, and then I got my pi right here. So this right here, let's give it a little bit color. This is the midline that usually happens for our graphs. And while we're thinking about it, well, what kind of graph would this be? Well, it looks to be a cosine graph, right? So that looks like I'm going to have, if that's the midline, that looks like I'm going to have a vertical shift going down. Well, there's only one that has a vertical shift going down, so that's 17. So we're going to pick G for that. And then finally, process elimination. Y is my last one, but yeah, we'll do that, and now we're gonna go back and talk about each graph. Okay, now we use this each time. So now that was the long and the short, that was the quick and dirty. So if you don't have any questions and that made sense to you, then you can just stop. But now we're gonna look and do each equation, looking at the graph, and we're gonna figure out the entire equation from just looking at the graph. Right? So my computer said I didn't have enough space to finish recording, so it conked out on me. That's why I'm doing it again. So I'm probably gonna try to go a little quicker. Guess I can leave the units up. Let's take that away though. Okay, so let's hit it. So I look at this graph. I already know that my axes go 1, 2, 3, 1, -1, -2, -3. So I look for what kind of graph am I dealing with. So my starting point at the y-axis, because we always are starting, because we're looking on the positive side, so we start on the y-axis. So looking at the y-axis, my starting point is at the origin. It goes up, the origin is on the midline. So it goes middle line, high point, middle line, low point, middle line. That is a sine graph. And then we need to think about the amplitude. So this is the midline, so I count up until I get to my high point. 1, 2, 3. So my from my midline to my high point is 3, so the amplitude is 3. Now let's think about frequency. Okay, so again, it's starting here, and then I've got from the midline to my high point, and I've got from the high point to the low point, and I've got from the high point to a midline again, and then I go from midline to low point, and then back to midline. That is one complete cycle of sine. But frequency says how many graphs do I have between 0 and 2 pi? Well, there's my starting point at the midline. There's my high point. Go back to the midline, hit the low point, come back to the midline. And that's another full graph. So that would tell me that my frequency is 2. Now, because my graph started at the origin, it doesn't look to have any movement left or right for phase. So there's no phase shift. And again, because my graph is sine and it's starting in on the midline, which is the origin, that's telling me that there's no vertical shift either. And so bada boom, 3 sine of 2x. Okay, so next, we're going to look at the second one. So first, we're going to look at the units. Going left to right, my first unit was 2 pi. So that means every unit after that is 2 pi. So that's 2 pi, 4 pi, 6 pi, 8 pi. So what about this one? Well, my first unit going up is 2. So that means we're going by 2's. So 2, 4, or going down -2, -4. Now so it's starting at the origin. That looks to be the midline. So that would mean this is a sine graph. So let's think about some amplitude. So amplitude is how far your graph goes from 0 to 2 pi. 2 pi is right here. And if I know sine, sine starts at the midline, hits the high point, goes back to the midline, goes to the low point, and then hits the midline and finishes it off. Well, it's only part of the graph. If I think about it like this looks to be 1, 2, 3, 4, that the graph is divided into fourths. So that would mean, and I was supposed to be doing amplitude, sorry. So let's put frequency because I jumped the gun. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4. This graph is cut into fourths. So from 0 to 2 pi, that's 1/4. So now let's get to amplitude. Amplitude, if that's the midline, remember that sine starts at the midline. So if that's the midline, I count up to the highest point. That's 2, 4. So my amplitude is 4. Now, because I'm dealing with sine and it's at the origin, that should mean that there is no um, phase shift and no vertical shift because it's starting at the origin. Because see, if there was a phase shift going up, it would have say started at 2 or started at 4. If there was a vertical shift going up, it would have started at 2 or started at 4 on this y-axis. If there was a phase shift, it wouldn't have started at the origin. It might have started here or there. So that's how I got that, and boom, y equals 4 sine of 1/4. So that's B. So this one, my high point of my graph is 2. My low point of my graph is 0. Those aren't the same, so I know I got a vertical shift. That was the stuff that me and Penny talked about. So there's a vertical shift, and it looks to be going up. So let's figure out what kind of graph we got. Well, my high point is 2, so I start at the high point. I, I missed that, and then I hit the low point. I keep going up, and then I end at the high point. So high, low, high, that's cosine. So I'm dealing with a cosine graph. Next, I need the vertical shift because we can tell there's a vertical shift because the midline isn't cutting it in half, and then my high point and low point aren't opposites. So the midline is usually 0. That's usually the midline. And the high point is 2. So if I look in between, I cut it in half, I'll find the middle. So it's 1, 2 units. So that 1 should be my midline. So now I got my midline. So now I can figure out my amplitude. So my amplitude goes from the midline to the highest point. Well, there's only 1 unit there. So the amplitude is 1. Now we get to frequency. So frequency says how much of your graph can you put between 0 and 2 pi? Well, here's 2 pi right there. And how much of the graph do I got between 0 and 2 pi? That went straight down the middle. It's 1/2. So the frequency is 1/2. So now that I got frequency, let's see if I have any phase shift or vertical shift. Well, we decided this was a cosine graph, so it should start high, hit the midline, hit low, go back to the midline, and then end high. There's nothing moving it left or right. It started on the y-axis right at the high point. So then that would be no, oops, that would be no vertical or phase shift. So a vertical shift, the same thing happens. That if I had a vertical shift, oh wait, I do have a vertical shift. So the midline is supposed to be at 0, but where's this midline? It's at 1. So the midline moved from 0 to 1. So it went up 1. So my graph, the equation of my graph should look like, because that's a 1, y cosine of 1/4 x plus 1. y cosine of 1/2 x plus 1. That was e, sorry. Okay, so we look at this one. So I got my units wrote out. So let's see. It's supposed to start either here at the midpoint, where the origin, or here at the high point. It's doing neither. So that's leading me to three possibilities. The first possibility is that we got a negative in front of our function. And because of the way it looks to be, it would be a negative sign. Because see, that's the normal shape of sine. It starts in the middle, or the midline, hits the high point, hits the middle, hits the low point, hits the middle. Well, this one is at the middle, but it's going to the low point first, hitting the middle, and then coming to the high point. So it's like I flip-flopped it, or a reflection, and that would be a reflection of sine. So either my stuff is negative sine, or it is a positive sign with some kind of phase shift. So the phase shift, the thing needs to be right here. So either they pushed it pi over 2, or they dragged it back pi over 2. So that would be x minus or plus, because we're not sure yet, pi over 2. So looking at this, so that could be sine, or it could be cosine, because see, cosine is supposed to start up here at the high point, and the high point's way right there. And so how far away is that high point? So that would be cosine plus or minus 3 pi over 4. Yeah, let's just close that up. Oops. Okay, so now that we did that, let's look at the amplitude. So of my amplitude, it starts at the midline and goes to the high point. Well, that's just one unit, even though it's stretched out, that's just one unit. So my amplitude would be 1. So now let's think about the frequency. Okay, so if we think about the frequency, from 0 to pi is one full graph. If it was sine flipped over, from 0 to pi, it would be one graph. So then that means because of frequency, the frequency goes from 0 to 2 pi. Well, from 0 to pi, I got one full graph. So then that would mean that if I went from 0 to 2 pi, I should have two graphs. So my frequency would be 2. Now it's a little off if it's a cosine graph. We're just going to say for giggles that it's 2, because we kind of know it's not cosine. But anyway, so now that we got all that, we just need to think about if there's a vertical shift. All right, so my graph is still starting at the origin, so it didn't move up or down. It may have flipped, but it didn't move up or down. It may have been dragged, or it may have been pushed, but it didn't move up or down. So there's no vertical shift on any of those. So then I look at which one is closest to my equation. Y equals sine of 2 times x plus pi over 2. So that would be it, f. So what they ended up doing was the graph actually started right here. This is negative pi over 2. And then the high point is negative pi over 4. And so they pulled the graph back to negative 2 pi. And so that's why our stuff is plus 2 pi. Two more graphs and then we're done. So let's hurry this up. So what kind of graph is this going to be? Well, it definitely looks like there's a vertical shift because this right here is the midline and it looks like it got moved down. So that's something that we got. But besides that, this is still the high point. That's still a low point. Then we could return to the high point. That's a cosine graph. And so now let's get that midline going. So this is the high point at -1, and the low point is at -3. So right in the middle is -2. So that's going to be our midline right in the middle. So there's my high point. There's my midline. There's my low point. Back to the midline, high point. So if my midline is at -2 and my high point is at -1, that's a difference between 1 unit. So my amplitude is 1. Doesn't matter if it's negative, amplitude is always positive. So my amplitude is 1. Now let's see about the frequency. Well, if I go from left to right, this is 0. I've got pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So is one complete cycle, one complete graph between 0 and 2 pi? Yes, there is exactly one complete graph. So that means the frequency is 1. So now let's look at phase shift. It's still on the y-axis starting at the high point, even though it got moved down. So that would be no to a phase shift because a phase shift pushes it or pulls it left or right. So what about now we're finally at the vertical shift. So that right there, that red line right here, is where my midline should be. But my midline for this one is right here. So this is 0, -1, -2, or 1, 2, and I'm subtracting. That's one of the things that's important. Know if you're going down, you're subtracting. If you're going up, you're adding. So that's going to be minus, in how many units? 1, 2. So y equals cosine of x minus 2. Y equals cosine x of minus 2. So that was what? G? Okay, that was G. And then finally, we got our last one. So let's start by putting together our axes. So I got one mark here. That's a 2. So the reason I just jumped into it because we already saw this before. So if there's a mark under the number that you got, then you're going by less than that. So that's 1, 2, 3. So my high point is 3. And then my low point is -3. So that tells me some things, but we're going to do this one step at a time. So this is the y-axis. So my graph should start here. It's starting at the high point. It's hitting the midline. It's going to the low point. It's going back to the midline and ending at a high point. That is a cosine graph. That's a cosine graph. So now that we know that, let's get our amplitude. Well, our amplitude, first is red. Our amplitude goes from the midline, which is this. See how that cuts that graph in half? So if this is the midline, we count up from the midline to get that distance is our amplitude. So 1, 2, 3. So my amplitude is 3. So now let's think about our frequency. So our frequency for this, it starts at the high point, it hits the midline, and goes to the low point, comes back to the midline, and ends at the high point. That is one complete cycle of cosine, and it's between 0 and 2 pi. So that frequency is 1. Between 0 and 2 pi, there's only one graph. So now, if we think about phase shift, the, the graph is starting on the y-axis, and it's starting at the high point, which is where it's supposed to start if it's a cosine graph. So that means it didn't move left or right, so it doesn't have a phase shift. And then we look at vertical shift, but my high point of the graph is +3. My low point of the graph is -3. So see, those two numbers are opposites. So that's telling me that I didn't move up or down. So then that's nothing on the vertical shift. So from this, I should just have y equals 3 times cosine of x. And there's my y right there. Boom. So that was the long and the short of it. Make sure that you understand your general form with amplitude A, frequency B, phase shift C, vertical shift D. Okay, I better stop this video before I run out of space. This is part 4, and I'll look forward to part 4 and part 5. I'm about to post them. All right, take care.